Well, here we are, the last podcast episode of this summer, which I'm honestly really bummed out about. I can't believe how fast summer just flew by this time, and the weather hasn't been helping. It's been really chilly lately, hence the sweater and the tea, but still I have some summer finished objects that I wanted to share with you, as well as my current works in progress and some acquisitions for the upcoming season. So please grab yourself a drink, grab your knitting or crafting project, and let's get started. As always, before we begin, please consider subscribing so you don't miss my future videos. Right now I'm at a very calm place with my knitting, which I know is actually a calm before the storm because pretty soon I will be fully diving into fall knitting, and I just know it's going to be non-stop from there with fall, then winter, Christmas, gift knitting, then 2026 projects. It's just gonna go on and on until spring, which is a good thing, and I'm really excited for this upcoming colder season. But while I still have like a good week of summer left, even though again it doesn't really look like it, I still wanted to take it slow and focus on some smaller scale projects. For example, I've been really enjoying knitting socks lately. I just unexpectedly got my sock knitting mojo back, and I'm really curious to see for how long it's gonna stay with me because I'm not an avid sock knitter. It usually comes and goes, but I am, as I said, really enjoying it this time. I also decided to wrap up my sewing for this season with a couple of project bags. I was able to use up some of my thrifted fabrics. I'm actually looking forward to using up more of my fabric stash. And I think I have just the perfect project in mind for these scraps because another sort of obsession I've been having is learning about English paper piecing from a class on Craftsy, who are kindly sponsoring today's episode. Craftsy has been a big supporter of this channel, so I'm super excited to be partnering with them again. They're an amazing online community and resource for creatives to advance their skills, to find new interests, and to stay inspired. They offer over 2,000 classes in more than 20 different DIY and crafting categories, including, of course, knitting, crochet, sewing, paper crafts, cake decorating, woodworking, and even gardening. So you'll definitely find something that will be interesting to you. If you're a regular viewer, you might already know that Craftsy has helped me a lot with my lace knitting, but this time I decided to dive into something that is a completely new craft to me with Ashley Huff's class on English paper piecing. She has multiple classes on different quilting and sewing techniques, but I was particularly drawn to English paper piecing just because of how straightforward and portable it is. You don't need a ton of supplies, you even don't need a sewing machine because everything is completely hand sewn and you can take your project pretty much anywhere with you. In that sense, I would say that it's much more comparable to knitting or embroidery than regular quilting or sewing. And Ashley's class is really densely packed with information, but it's not overwhelming at all. It's super easy to follow. And same goes for pretty much every other Craftsy class I've tried. They're all taught by award-winning professionals who are ready to share their knowledge in the most approachable and friendly way possible. Craftsy would be perfect for you regardless of whether you want to take your existing crafting skills to the next level or just casually learn something new and fun, and of course, connect with fellow makers along the way. So if you want to explore Craftsy, please do so by following the link in the description or scanning the QR code on the screen, because the first 1,000 of you to use the offer will get a full year of Craftsy Premium membership for just $1.49. And this is valid for new members only, but it will include access to every single Craftsy class for a full year. So make sure you check out the offer, and thank you so much, Craftsy, for sponsoring today's episode. Okay, girl, I'm pretty sure there's been a misunderstanding. I didn't lay out my knits on the table for you to comfortably birdwatch. So, can you move? So my first finished object is something I haven't actually introduced on here as a work in progress. This was such a spur of the moment cast on and a really quick knit. I basically just watched it fly off my needles and then ended up with a finished object. Suddenly, this is my plain yoke Tee 22 from Lene, and in this case 22 means that the gauge is 22 stitches per 10 centimeters. She has multiple versions for different gauges, and she also has the pattern called the plain yoke blouse, which if you watched my summer knitting plans video, you know I actually intended to make, but my plans have changed. And this pattern is really simple. The increases for the yoke are really seamless. I don't remember what this increase is called, but it's different from the usual M1 left or M1 right. For example, you pick up your worked stitch from like 2 rows below your current row, and then kind of knit through it, so it looks really seamless. It's also a very beginner-friendly pattern because it has instructions for both a version with shirt row shaping and without any shirt row shaping, so it's fully knit in the round. And I really love circular yoke patterns from Lene. I think they actually look really like flattering on me, or like maybe it's because I've knit at this point like 3 patterns with this construction and I just know how they will fit me and what I need to like change or where I should stop in terms of my width of the body and sleeves for it to fit me, you know, as best as it can. I knit this t-shirt pretty much per pattern. I was knitting size small, but I did do a slight modification. It starts with this rolled stockinette edge at the neckline, and you basically don't do any ribbing or anything at the hem. You just cast off in long tail cast off. But I didn't want the edge to roll too much, so I added this ridge of purl stitches to kind of divide the ribbing, or like not the ribbing, the hem section and the main body of the t-shirt. And because I had a limited amount of yarn to work with, I went with this sort of baby tee look. You might know that when I was making my Palma tee, which has basically the same construction but with lace at the circular yoke, I went for a bigger size than I usually wear because I wanted it to be more roomy and like drapey. But for this one, I didn't have that luxury because I was using this Gepard Garn Hørsilke yarn, which I originally bought for a different project. I bought it to make the Chantal top, for which this one is the recommended yarn, but that project ended up being a complete fiasco, and I'm really glad I frogged it. It was just not working out, but I was left with 4 balls of this yarn, so 200 grams, and it was pretty much not enough to make any sort of garment from it apart from something sleeveless. But I like my knitted sleeveless tops to have negative ease, and with this yarn, it's going to be pretty hard to make anything stretchy from it because this yarn is really peculiar in a way that it is really drapey, which is a big plus, I guess, for this t-shirt specifically. Like, this drape is just amazing, but this yarn is really hard to knit ribbing with in terms of like your ribbing is really flat and it looks more like a stitch pattern than like functional stretchy ribbing. So this really limited the pool of patterns I could choose from. Any garment that relies on stretchiness or ribbing to provide this like form-fitting shape and negative ease was sort of out of the question with this yarn. And I also didn't want to pair it with anything because I really liked on the swatch how just the heathery texture of it looked on its own. I knew I needed a stockinette project that has very little ribbing or any sort of lace or stitch patterns in it to save some yarn, and I briefly considered making a shawl, something summery and lacy, but the thing is, I have a lot of yarns in my stash that are kind of put aside for shawls already. They're the perfect quantity, the perfect weight, so, you know, using up this yarn for another shawl seemed kind of, I don't know, wasteful to me, so I decided to go through Ravelry one more time and basically ended up choosing between the Sabai top from Suzanne Muller and the plain Yoke Tee. I obviously decided against the Sabai top. I really like this pattern and it's been huge lately, but I don't think it's for me because, again, it doesn't have any negative ease in it and it will look on me like 2 rectangles, and I know it. It looks amazing on other people, but again, I don't think it'll suit me. So I then saw Merlin Knits version of the plain Yoke Tee with the same gauge, so plain Yoke Tee 22, and decided to just, you know, give it a go. So I tried a swatch on 4mm needles for like a bigger gauge for the 20 stitches per 10 centimeters, but it was kind of too open for me, and I liked the version on 3.5mm a lot more. Just the stitch definition was much more appealing to me, so I cast it on and it was, again, just flying off my needles. I was having so much fun working on it. The increases are really easy to keep track of, and just seeing this really simple and plain yoke open up was really satisfying. And even though I really like the color of this yarn and the drape of this yarn, and just it's one of those linen yarns that feel really cool to the touch, so it's perfect to wear on like hotter summer days, but I did not enjoy working with this yarn. It's so splitty. It's just really, really uncomfortable. You have to be like always on the lookout for your needle like accidentally grabbing one of the strands. So this is all I have left of my original quantity. It's about 6 grams in here, so probably if you're intending to make the plain Yoke Tee in size small like me, you can get away with 200 grams of this yarn. But as I was saying, this yarn is super splitty. It's basically this super loose chainette or like cord yarn and the individual strands just want to like poke through and unravel themselves. Also, one of the strands, if you pull it accidentally, it will just unravel this chain net entirely, and of course it'll make your like yarn quantity longer, but that's probably not what you want, and it's just really, really annoying to work with it. And I can see it already splitting in a couple of places or like tugging, really frustrating. But otherwise this yarn is really pleasant to wear. Maybe avoid it if you tend to work, for example, with pointier needles like Chaugu red lace, for example, or if you prefer to knit stockinette without looking at it. Or perhaps I think it might not be that much of an issue if you're pairing this yarn with other yarns, but to be honest, it's still a bit of a deal breaker for me, so I'm not sure I will be working with this yarn again. I really would like to try Gepard Garn's Wild and Soft, and it's spun completely differently, so probably it will not have this particular issue. But since that yarn is really summery, I think I will try it next year in one of my future projects, and I've also heard that it's good for pairing with other yarns, so we'll see. But so far, to be honest, I hadn't had the best experience with Gepard Garn yarns because I have knit the Peacock cardigan also from Lene last year using Gepard Garn's Pure Lana. It was 50% wool and 50% alpaca. They also have a version with just wool, so I don't know if it's the version I used, if it's the colorway or like this yarn in general, but it pills like crazy. It's one of the worst yarns in terms of pilling that I've worked with and like worn. It's just so annoying. It looks ragged. It looks so bad. I kind of stopped wearing that cardigan because of the pilling issue. I'm depilling it constantly, and I think at this point I'm just making it worse. And I've seriously been considering frogging that cardigan just because of how unusable it is. Like, I'm kind of ashamed to wear it out because it looks like an old house cardigan, and it's only been a year, which is a huge shame. So I think I might frog it and reuse the yarn for something else, but pair it with either silk mohair or like alpaca mohair, something that will kind of enclose the original yarn into other fluffy fibers. Yeah, so far not a really good experience with Gepard Garn yarns. I also have their, I think it's called Kid Silk Tweed. I have 50 grams of that mohair, and I wanted to save it for either a lightweight shawl project or like a little scarf, or maybe pair it with another yarn to make a hat or some kind of winter accessory. And I think that one will hold up much better than these yarns, mostly because, again, I will be pairing it with something. But I don't know, let me know about your experience with Gepard Garn. They seem like a really cool brand with a lot of nice blends and nice different options for both like winter knitting and summer knitting, but I'm kind of hesitant to try more of their yarns, even though, as I said, I'm really interested in the Wild and Soft yarn. But anyway, let me know. But going back to the t-shirt, I would say it was mostly a really positive knitting experience because, again, the pattern is super simple and super fun to knit. It's just a really relaxing knit in general because you don't have to worry about anything, basically. Like, once you're done with the shirt rows, you're just knitting stockinette tubes and then do some more stockinette and just a smaller needle size before you cast off. It's just the most mindless garment knitting you can imagine, and the result is very nice. I think this color goes really well with a lot of things I have in my wardrobe, and I have just one little issue with the fit is that I don't know why, but this edge on the body is kind of fluting a little bit. I went down to 3 millimeters for both the rolled edges on the hem and on the sleeves, and I started with 3 millimeters to knit the neckline, but it still goes into this like subtle A-line shape. But otherwise, I think it was a really successful basic knit, which I'm really glad to have in my wardrobe now. And my next finished object is another banger. It's a bit more elaborate than the plain Yoke Tee, and this is my twist loop top. I'm really proud of this knit, and I would say that it turned out to be everything I wanted it to be. I wanted to knit this pattern for a while now, basically since it came out, but I couldn't get gauge. It only had one recommended yarn at that point, which was impossible for me to get and also impossible to like figure out what I can substitute it with. The thing that really frustrated me back then when I first tried to knit this pattern is the fact that it was written in a way that is really honestly annoying to me. I don't want to get like too mean or snarky, but it really frustrates me as a pattern reader and user, I would say, when designers come up with their own abbreviations for really well established stitches and techniques. For example, here in the original twist loop top, because it was updated since then, she used, let me even pull up the pattern so I can tell you. It was L-ink for the left-leaning increase and R-ink for the right-leaning. And for the pearl ones, let me see, it was L-ink P for the pearl left-leaning increase. Maybe I'm just a bit spoiled by mainstream designers like Petiteknit, who uses standard abbreviations. I just find it to be needlessly frustrating, and sometimes they even overlap their abbreviations with the standard ones. And for example, you see M1 and instead of make one, it actually means marker one or something. And it's actually one of the reasons why I don't really knit a lot of Ukrainian patterns, because every designer seems to come up with their own terminology and language, and you need to really keep track of what they mean. And I know it's a me issue. I can just read through the pattern, check and remember what every abbreviation and term means, but it just really streamlines my knitting process when I can just trust the designer to use standard terms. So this pattern, the twist loop top pattern, was updated in June, I think, with standard abbreviations. I'm not really sure where I'm going with this. Like, let me know your thoughts, because I know that a lot of effort and planning and testing, tech editing goes into making a pattern. So maybe that was the right choice for the designer to include their own terms, because they might be standard, for example, throughout their whole pattern library. So maybe it's just a question of personal preference, and something similar to, for example, how some people prefer written instructions to charts and vice versa. So there might be no right answer. I'm just kind of sharing my thoughts. But this time it was really smooth sailing with this pattern, apart from the neckline, which I was reknitting 3 times. I was really losing steam and motivation about this project on my 3rd attempt, which thankfully worked out. It was the last thing I needed to do on this garment, so I just finally was able to call it done. But it took me a lot of effort and a lot of careful frogging, because my first attempt was way too tight. As I explained last time, I just barely got my head through it and then got stuck, which was a first in my, knitting journey, but I thought that I can just easily fix it by just picking up more stitches and making my Italian bind off a little bit looser, but it didn't work. I picked up, I think, maybe 30 extra stitches compared to what I originally did, and it was still way too tight. My 3rd attempt, which was actually after I briefly thought about maybe just scrapping the ribbed neckline altogether and doing an I-cord similar to the armholes. I think I-cord would have looked nice here as well, but I really wanted it to look as per original design. So I decided what I would do is, since I'm using thread weight yarn, I was using 4 strands of this yarn held together. So I decided to add a 5th strand on my neckline and use 2.5mm needles instead of the 2mm I originally used, and still pick up more stitches. I think kind of the trick with this neckline is for it to look loose when the garment is just like laying flat, because when you put it on, it basically looks fine, and of course you can get your head through it. And the added bonus of using an extra 5th strand on the ribbing here is that this neckline looks really plump, like the stitches look really defined, which I really like. And in general, I just adore the look of this garment. I think it looks really nice on me. The size I chose was perfect. The length is great. The cables look really nice as well. So overall, I'm really happy with this knit, and I have a lot of this yarn left over, and honestly, no idea what to do with it. I have about 150 grams left. And of course, some of my leftover quantity is spun into 5 strands held together or 4 strands held together. So maybe I'll use it for some kind of a gift knit down the line. But at the same time, I'm glad I picked up more than I needed, because another nightmare you can get into with thread weight yarn is not having enough. Another project I finished in July was my Tulipan Tee, which isn't actually my Tulipan Tee. I was knitting it for a friend and she already has it, so I don't have it with me to show you, but I'll try and include a lot of b-roll and pictures so you can appreciate its beauty, because I am really pleased with this knit. I wish I had time this summer to knit another one for myself, but as I said, I was knitting so many of these similar Lene patterns lately. Hopefully next year I will get some distance from it and will be interested in knitting another version, and Lene might come up with another pattern or another lace pattern for the same construction, so I'm curious to see how it's going to turn out next year. year, and there's not really much to say about the pattern itself because I talked about it in my vlog and in the previous podcast. The pattern is wonderful. The yarn I used was pretty nice. It's drops Belle, so I'm just happy that my friend likes it. She likes the color we chose, she likes the fit, the length, the size is great on her, so everything worked out really nicely. And the last finished object I wanted to talk about, or like the last knitted finished object, is this really cute pair of socks. This pair of socks is what sparked my sock knitting mojo to come back, and you might recognize this yarn from my advent that I got for Christmas and also from my summer knitting plans video. I wanted to make some kind of a striped design, but ended up trying to squeeze all of the limited quantity of yarn I had for a pair of just vanilla socks to showcase the beauty of this hand-dyed yarn, which I think worked out. But these originally were not supposed to be vanilla, like plain socks with ribbing. I was trying to make the Ruffle socks from Petiteknit, and it was a roller coaster, to be honest. I knew that I would not have enough of this hand-dyed yarn to make both the ruffles, the heels, and the socks themselves in one color, so I decided to use the green hand-dyed yarn, which is like the solid hand-dyed yarn, for the ruffle, and have this almost like flower with a little petal on top effect, which looked much better in my head. First of all, the ruffle itself was a struggle. I really underestimated the difficulty of these ruffled socks, and it's just the final boss of fiddly knitting. I hated every second of making this ruffle, at least until I figured out how to make it easier on myself and like more straightforward. So you cast on around 300 stitches, like depending on your size, and you start to rapidly decrease. You like decrease every stitch, and it asks for a twisted decrease, so like through the back loop. And I cast on 2.5 needles on the DPNs, of course, and my needle just couldn't get through the stitches to do the decrease. I broke my needles because I'm usually using these shorter bamboo needles from Chowgo for my socks. They are really nice and really like petite because I really don't like to work with longer DPNs, but they're really fragile and they tend to bend, and I just snapped my needle on like the third attempt at decreasing. So then, because I didn't want to cast on 300 stitches again, I, instead of just casting on a bigger needle, tried to transfer my stitches to a smaller metal 2mm needle, and it still was really hard to get like into the stitches to do the decrease. It took me a really long time, but I felt committed to get through it. So I don't know, I should have just, started over and cast on a bigger needle, but I didn't. So like on the second round, I realized it's not getting any better. So I decided that I don't really care what kind of decrease it's gonna be. It's not gonna make that much of a difference. So instead of trying to do this twisted decrease, I started decreasing through knitting one, slipping one, and then passing the slip stitch over, and it was a really good decision. It saved me a lot of time, and my advice to you, if you're knitting these socks and you don't want to lose your mind, please cast on 3mm needles, or at least use 2 needles to cast on, which I think the last time I did it was when I was actually learning how to knit. I'm not sure people do that anymore. I certainly stopped doing it after like 3 months of knitting because I realized that it's really unnecessary. But when I was just learning how to knit through YouTube videos, most of the videos I watched had somebody hold 2 needles side by side and like wrapping the yarn through both of the needles. Maybe it helps when you're a beginner to have the stitches looser, and again, for these socks, it's also really helpful. Just make sure that your setup round or like setup stitches are super loose and open. It's gonna look fine. It's not gonna make the ruffle look uneven or sloppy or anything. It's just gonna save you so much time. And also don't do the twisted decrease. Just do knit one, slip one, pass slip stitch over. It's gonna be so much easier. I can really vouch for this method because my second ruffle took me like half the time of the first one. But then I had another issue because I knit the ruffle in the green yarn and then wanted to join my hand-dyed yarn to have this again sort of leaf and flower or like leaf and berry effect. And for some reason I thought I can get away with not alternating yarn because I actually had 2 balls of yarn. One was more cool toned and one was more like brownish and warm toned, but both were pink. And I decided I would start with the more brownish one and then kind of alternate for a couple of rounds and join the more violet one instead. And
oh my god, bro. Oh, hell no, man.
I was knitting it in the evening, so I wasn't really paying attention to the color that I was ending up with. In the morning, I looked at it and decided that like it's just gonna go and I need to actually do helical knitting or helical knitting. I'm not really sure how it's pronounced, but basically I need to alternate every round, and I did that. The fabric looked a lot nicer and a lot more kind of unmuddied. There was no pooling or anything. When I finished the sock and just looked at this combination of this hand-dyed foot and green ruffle on top, it looks so ugly to me. At the same time, it looked really childish, but really outdated, and like not in a good way, not in a vintage way or like retro way. It just looked bad, and something about this green and these violet / pink colors was really clashing. I knew I had to cut off the ruffle, but I didn't want to unravel the whole sock because of course I was knitting it top down from like the cuff down. But I also knew that I wanted to save this ruffle just because of how long it took me to make it. So I just tried to really carefully cut the stitches and pull one round basically and pick up the live stitches on the needle, so then I can knit from this side up. It just looks a lot more clean and doesn't clash with all of these different specs in the hand-dyed section, so I'm really glad that I made this decision. I also did this little rolled edge here before casting off because I really didn't want to do an Italian cast off on the sock. It was just really annoying that I had to do so much surgery for such a simple pair of socks. Then I knit the second sock, which I started actually with a provisional cast on to then do the ribbing in the same way as the first sock, but I was in a different pickle by the end of that sock. I ran out of yarn, so I had to basically comb through my apartment for any little scraps, leftovers, gauge swatches, little sock leftover balls and stuff, and just integrate whatever I could to finish the toe. It was a really interesting experience. I think I had like 10 or 12 different ends to weave in here, but it looks really fun. I think it adds a little extra something to these socks because at the top they look really clean and have a really nice contrast between the off-white cuff and the hand-dyed sock, but then when you get to the toes, it just, you know, it's really fun. It's really playful. I don't work with hand-dyed yarns a lot, so I'm always curious to see how the colors will open up and what is the like actual colorway I'm gonna end up with. I also think helical knitting and alternating every round worked out great here, but of course I wasn't able to do that on the heels because they were standard German short row heels. I just used one of the yarns on one heel and the other on the other, and they look different, but I don't think it's that kind of noticeable and doesn't distract from the overall colorway of the socks. I was really happy with these socks and I had itchy sock fingers, whatever that means. So I decided to have another go at trying to knit the ruffle socks, but I didn't have any solid yarn for socks that I can use in this pattern. So I went to my local yarn store and picked up this sock yarn, which is also hand-dyed, but it's mostly solid, and I wanted something lighter but not white because I think white socks are basically single-use socks, or they can only be house socks or something you can wear only to bed, because once you put these socks in a sole, most soles, for example, in my shoes, are made out of leather and they're usually in a darker leather, so it'll just get stained. For the effort that goes into knitting socks, I don't think it's worth it, so I went with this lighter gray color and I cast on my second technically pair of ruffle socks. So this is the first sock, and of course it looks horrible now because it's unblocked and the stitch definition is really wonky, but once it will be blocked, it'll look a lot more beautiful. Here I had some problems with this folded edge. It ended up being a little bit too wide for me, so I added some elastic inside of it. I just need to cast on the second one. I actually did already cast it on, but I didn't do a lot of work on it because I honestly wanted to show you how ridiculous it looks before you finish the ruffle. So this is what it looks like. It's just this random array of needles and just an enormous amount of stitches. I'm really happy that I found a way to make this pattern a lot more palatable because I was literally losing my mind. I didn't expect it to be so difficult. Also, I wanted to show you my finished project bags, which I mentioned in the intro. This is the first one. It's made entirely out of thrifted materials. This is thrifted, the fabric is thrifted, the thread is thrifted as well as the lining, and I'm really happy with it. I had this little scrap of quilting cotton in my fabric stash. I picked it up at a thrift store last year and used it in my kind of first attempt at a quilting project. I made a pillow out of it, and I had a big scrap left over, which I thought would be perfect for a simple drawstring project bag. It also has a pocket, so it's not just a regular drawstring pouch, and I made one of the pockets a little bit narrower because I knew I would mostly use this project bag for sock projects or something that is on a DPN. So one of the pockets is a bit narrower than the other, so I can just put my pack of DPNs inside of there. I think I might pick up a set of these Knit Pro Ginger DPNs in 2.5 millimeter because 2.5 is usually what I use for my sock projects, and I only have these like Chowgo bamboo ones, but as I said, they're really pliable and really fragile. But these ginger needles are made out of like birch or something, and they're a lot more sturdy and actually one of my favorite wooden needles to use. So I think I might get them in a more standard sock knitting size. This is the 3 millimeter one. I'm using it to pick up stitches for the ruffle, and I have another project bag which I made, which is like similar shape. It's also just a drawstring bag, but it's much bigger because I had a bigger piece of fabric, and it also has lining. The main fabric here is not thrifted. It's actually Japanese quilting cotton that has this like weaved design in it, and I am super proud of this edge or like this seam. I managed to line up this little flower almost perfectly, and it was a complete accident because look at the other side. Obviously didn't happen on this side as well, but I'm still really pleased with this project. Sewing these sorts of drawstring bags is a really simple process once you get your pieces cut out, especially if you cut the pieces correctly and evenly, which I was able to do because I have a cutting mat and a rotary cutter. But still, I think after these two projects, I'm definitely done with sewing on a sewing machine for at least the next couple of months. I wasn't able to do any garment sewing because I had most of my plans derailed this August. I'm just not in the mood for sewing, except for, trying something new and fun with the English paper piecing, which is done without a sewing machine with just, a needle in your hand, so it doesn't really count. But anything that involves taking out my cutting mat, setting up the sewing machine, it's just too complicated for me right now. I'm realizing that my biggest problem with sewing is just the size of my apartment and just how small my working area is. It's really at the same time easy, but also hard to keep a smaller like studio apartment neat. But when you're sewing, it gets out of hand so quickly. The threads and the dust and the little scraps get everywhere. Basically, when I start a sewing project, I need to see it through like on the same day because otherwise I will be living in a complete mess, and my boyfriend will be as well, and my cat can get into the threads and, have a snack. It's just really kind of frustrating to have to start sewing something and then have to clean up and then take it all out again the next day or like a day later to continue. So I don't think I'm that kind of cut out for sewing, no pun intended. The only solution I found so far is to cut out my pieces on one day, clean up, and then start sewing the pieces on a completely different day, because I find that most of the mess actually comes from cutting the fabric, all of the threads and dust and stuff like that. But even then, I think I will never get this like intense sewing mojo like I do with knitting, for example. It's just a completely different craft and like making experience compared to sewing. I just need to keep that in mind when I come across a beautiful piece of fabric. And before I continue with my works in progress, I think I need to like give a little bit of a context. I was really sick in August and it derailed most of my plans. It is really unfair and really annoying. I had this amazing, productive, creative, and relaxing August planned. It was supposed to be like the best month of this summer, if not of this whole year, but all of it went down the drain because I got really sick. Most of the time I wasn't really well enough to knit or like to look at knitting, so I had my projects basically in the same state before and after I got sick, and the ones I managed to work on while I was in bed ended up like doing me more harm than good when it comes to like my whip situation, because I made, for example, a whole set of mistakes on my Jenny jacket, which is not on the needles right now because I have to frog back. And before that, I need to like really sit down and understand where I actually went wrong and what happened to this project. So when you saw it last, I was working on my back panel. And when I was sick, I picked up both of the front panels. And I think most of my issues come from the fact that the increases here at the neckline are done every third row, not every second row, for which you can like clearly keep track of your increases because they're usually just done on the right side row. But here you had to like really keep track of what you're doing and at the same time keep track of the stitch count or like row count so you can do the smocking stitch as well. And it was just too much for my foggy brain. I couldn't figure it out, but I was persevering for some stupid reason. I was really trying to get through it so I can join it together and start knitting the body, because I had this like ridiculous, considering the circumstances, idea that I would finish it by the end of August. So when it was time, or so I thought, to join these pieces in the round, it turned out that this piece and the back piece are on a completely different stage of the smocking stitch pattern, and also this side is longer than this side, or the other way around, I don't remember. And it turned out that I did an extra row that I wasn't supposed to do on here, so that's why it was not aligned. So I frogged back, or more accurately, I literally took my fabric shears and cut off this piece right here. I still have it somewhere actually, and just started over, and it wasn't fun. I worked on this panel for a whole day, and then I joined it together again. I started with the round side row, and of course everything was fine because it's a round side row, you can't really see anything. But on my next smocking row, I realized that there's still a difference between these three pieces. So I'm not sure, maybe I made a mistake in the back panel as well because I finished it when I got sick, and maybe the left front panel is also funky. I don't know, it's just funky overall. I just don't want to frog it again. I think I need to like really read through the pattern and count all of my rows and all of my like smocking stitches and really take my time to get this project back on track, because I don't want to frog it at all. As you know, this yarn is kind of cursed already, and I want it to be in a finished, nice, beautiful garment, but I don't think I'm still in a brain space to just deal with it, especially after a failed attempt. It was a bit upsetting to see my favorite work in progress at that point turn into this ridiculous mismatched mess, and I decided that from now on, if, and like it's more a question of when I get sick again, I think I'm going to try and limit myself to stockinette knits, to something that is mindless, just something that doesn't have any decreases, any stitch patterns, any row counts you have to follow or anything like that. Not because I'm like strict with myself or like I need to give myself some kind of restriction, but it's just not productive for me. I will be wasting limited energy as it is to work on something that I will not have the brain space to see through properly. Because I think sometimes when I am really sick, I try to kind of force myself to enjoy knitting, to first of all show that I'm still productive and like I'm not just in bed doing nothing, which is a ridiculous mindset to be in. I understand it. I also want to like relax with knitting, because knitting is usually really relaxing to me. Like the last thing I want for my knitting to be is straining or frustrating. So I just try to pretend like it's all normal and I'm not actually being really sick. I'm just, relaxing with knitting, which isn't the case. And I always end up regretting it and having to kind of sort out my previous mistakes when I get better, instead of, just picking up where I left off and doing some actually productive or fun or relaxing knitting. So another work in progress that I cast on right before I was sick and was working really sparingly, during my illness was the Puro Cardigan Light from Rui Yamamuro, which I also mentioned in my summer knitting plans. And I'm still not past the raglan increases, but I am enjoying it. It was pretty simple to work on it while, in bed, because I had my markers for the increases, so I was able to keep track of them. Nothing really much to say about it. To be honest, I don't remember casting it on. I know I did before I got sick, but my memory is really splotchy. Right now, I'm just, working on this whip I randomly have, and the construction of this cardigan is really interesting in the sense that you do regular raglan increases on the back, but at the front you start by doing increases on only one side for the front, but you leave the kind of shoulder stitches alone and have this more straight line on the shoulder before you start to do raglan increases for the sleeves as well. So it gives it an extra something, and I really like the structured look of this cardigan. The yarn I'm using for it is this Lac Lamont tweed from BC Garn, which is one of my favorite yarns. It's so soft, so pleasant to work with. It's not itchy. For example, here I used the Samsøe yarn, also from BC Garn. It's pretty much, I would say, the same yarn, but just the weight is a little bit different. And I used the Lac Lamont for the contrasting red. It's been a couple of months since I made this sweater, and I'm still really impressed with the yarn, with like the quality and the softness of it. It does spill slightly, but depilling it is pretty easy. You can just basically pick up the bubbles. There's no need to like really brush it out. It's not that dramatic, especially compared to, for example, the situation I have with the Gepard Garn Pure Lana. Anyway, I decided to use it here just in the stockinette project to showcase, I guess, the beauty of this yarn and the softness of it. The needle size I'm using is 3.5, which is the recommended needle size for this garment, but I'm actually not hitting gauge. I think I found some notes for my gauge swatches, and I think my gauge is out by 2 stitches. It's a little bit bigger, but still I don't think it's gonna hurt the finished object, and I am pretty pleased to be working on something simple and stockinette. But one of the ways in which I try to kind of get myself back into, not being sick and enjoy knitting again is by doing smaller projects that are just really easy to focus on. I just wanted something really simple and something that doesn't require me to have multiple steps and put stitches on hold and do some increases and join different pieces together. So that's why I've been really enjoying doing the Ruffle socks. Also, another cast on, which is a really recent cast on, is my Flora Scarf. It's a triangular all over lace scarf with I-cords around the edges, and it's knit tip to tip, so from one side to the other. And it's a pretty straightforward knit, even though it's all over lace. It's fully charted. You don't have any written instructions, but the chart is super easy to memorize after a while because it's just these diamonds which you alternate. It's originally intended for a much bigger needle size and for DK weight yarn. I think you knit it on 4mm needles, but I'm using 2.5 because I'm using a much thinner yarn. This is Alpaca 2 from Isager, and I only have one ball of this yarn, so I really wanted to use it in a small scarf. I knew that my 250 meters would be enough for a lacy scarf, and also because this yarn is thin but has a slight halo, it would be beautiful in a lace pattern. It doesn't look maybe that impressive right now because again it's unblocked and I have to really stretch it out for you to see the lace pattern, but I think once it's blocked it's going to be beautiful. And I think because I'm using a smaller needle, I actually need to add a panel in the middle without any increases or decreases, just knit straight for a while, because otherwise I think my scarf would be just too short in width for me to be able to tie it around my neck. So I think I'll divide my yarn quantity in half and kind of see how much I can add in the middle before I need to start decreasing. I've been really enjoying this project just because, again, it's really small. It fits in the smallest project bag I have, and there's something really soothing and really satisfying at the same time about doing these lace repeats and crossing them out. And I know I don't need to make any big decisions regarding this project. I don't need to have a an assembly plan for this knit. I do need, as I said, to like weigh my yarn and see how much I can squeeze into the middle, but otherwise right now my only like goal is to get through the first chart. I don't know, I'm just really enjoying it. Being sick really sucks. Being sick when you're as like creative and restless as I am, for example, is even suckier, but I'm on track to just finally get to a point where I can pick up where I left off, because it feels like I was put on a timeout, which I didn't deserve. And I'm trying to put a positive spin on it. I'm trying to treat it like, you know, a blank page from which I can start my future, for example, fall knits, and just really like reevaluate what I'm doing and what I'm spending my energy on. And before we wrap up for today, I wanted to show you my acquisitions from Knitting for Olive. This is Knitting for Olive Cotton Merino, which I bought for my Camisole number 9, which I'm actually planning to knit next year. I don't think I'll have time to cast on something that summery this year. And these two yarns are actually for the Songbird mitten pattern, which I really wanted to make last year but didn't find the suitable yarn for it. And I was really trying to choose the perfect like color combination for that pattern, because the colorwork pattern itself is really detailed and is the main focus of the mittens. So I didn't want the colors to clash, and I think this monochrome combo is going to be wonderful for it. This color is called Midnight, and this one is pearl gray. So not truly black and white, but still monochrome and like minimalistic enough to let the birdie pattern shine through. And I think there is a chance that this cotton merino might not actually hibernate until spring, just because it's this gorgeous fall color. It's so warm and chestnutty. I think I might use it for a fall shawl, like a bigger shawl, because even though I knit a lot of shawls in my like knitting experience, I haven't actually made one for myself. They were mostly gifts, so I might, you know, use it sooner than next season. And I won't be making any solid plans until I get better. I'm still recovering, and for now everything feels like it takes twice the effort, and I just got my voice back a couple of days ago, so I'm getting there. And I'm sorry if this episode felt a little bit rambly than usual. It's just the energy I have right now, and I will be back with a lot more energy really soon, and I am really excited for fall. So thank you for spending this time with me. I really appreciate you being here and watching. I hope you had an amazing summer or winter if you're down under, and if you haven't subscribed, please consider subscribing. But honestly, I'm just glad that you're watching, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.